Hello and welcome to The Obscure, a podcast describing interesting people that deserve to be better known. We take interesting characters from history, out of obscurity and into the limelight, focusing on a different character every episode. I'm Daniel Darkens.
And I'm Nina Bickerton. We will be producing a new episode every fortnight, landing wherever you get your podcasts on a Saturday morning, if you're in the UK. Subscribe so that you don't miss each new episode.
Hello everyone. I am absolutely delighted to be joined for another episode by my very dear friend Minna Hayman. Hello Minna, how are you doing today?
Hello Daniel, I'm very well, thank you. Very warm.
Yes, it's been, this is the second one of these that we've done them a couple of weeks apart, and it's just as hot this time as I think it was last time. But anyway, let's move on to today's episode. And I never thought I would be saying this on this particular podcast, but today I would like to be talking to you about a former head of ICE.
Okay, right. I thought that you were talking about British people mainly.
Yes, they do tend to be British people. Today is an English person. It's a chap called George Parker Bidder, and he spent 2 years as the chair of the Institution of Civil Engineers. And I'm sure they call themselves ICE.
Right, so a little bit different and a little bit more, should I say, calculating?
Calculating, that's a word we're going to use more than once today. But yes, George Parker Bidder. And when we did the previous episode, Minna, it was somebody that we kind of had a very vague connection to. We also have a link to this particular person. George Parker Bidder was born in the town of Moretonhampstead in Devon. And for our listeners and viewers, Minna and I first met in July 2017 at the start of a cycle ride from Land's End to John O'Groats. And on the second day, we crossed over Dartmoor in Devon, and we had a very nice downhill finish to the day, which ended up in the town of Moretonhampstead. So George Parker Bidder was born in June 1806.
Okay.
His life effectively splits into two parts: his early years and his adult years. He was the son of a stonemason. So they weren't a very grand family, very sort of working class family in a very small town in Devon.
In the middle of nowhere, rather?
Yes.
Dartmoor
Yes.
as an area is either sort of forbidding in a way, and all that you have is just rolling hills and sheep and ponies and
Yes.
surprising weather.
Yes, indeed. So there was a school in the village, though, and he attended the village school from the age of 4. But when I say he attended the village school, he seems to have spent more time playing truant than he was actually there. And it doesn't seem as though he learned to read or write when he was at the school. And it sounds like it was a complete waste of the 1.5 pence per week that it cost to attend the school. He did have a couple of older brothers and 3 younger brothers. So he was one of 6 children. He didn't really learn anything to do with numbers at school in his very early years. And his only instructor in numbers was his older brother, who gave him the real foundation knowledge that we all need in mathematics. He taught him to count to 10.
Yep.
Who needs more than that?
Solid start.
And he succeeded in that. So his brother then taught him how to count up to 100, and that was it.
Well, exponential growth.
It's quite. But that seems to have sowed some sort of seed in George. There was a smithy quite close to where he lived, so a blacksmith's forge. And he would just spend time around there, and so he really enjoyed being involved with the forge. So he was around there one particular evening, and somebody mentioned a sum. Now, George had never been taught adding up, subtracting, multiplication, anything like that. So when somebody mentioned the sum, they didn't mention it to George. It was just people talking, and George gave the correct answer. So they asked him some more, and he got them all right. So he had actually worked out from his brother telling him the numbers 1 to 100, he'd actually calculated or worked out for himself the multiplication tables, which is quite something. How do you work it out from scratch with nobody even telling you what multiplication is? He was around 6 when he had answered these questions, and he walked out of that forge with half a pence in his pocket. And if you think a 6-year-old in Moretonhampstead with half a penny in his pocket, he'd have felt a rich boy.
Yeah, exactly. And this is rewarding. So
Yes, there's something in this. But his father thought there's something in this as well. And his father actually started to take him to local fairs to show him off. He was given the name the Calculating Boy.
That is so funny. I mean, it's such a quintessential part of the country fairs or whatever of that time that you had some sort of spectacles of whatever. I mean, either bearded woman or wrestling match or the fortune teller. So this would have been, truly a marvel.
Yes, indeed. So it started off, it was fairly local to home. So he was at a fair in Wellington in Somerset when he was about 8, still not even able to read or write. But if you gave him a list of 2-digit numbers, he could add those up with ease. So it was really impressive, even then.
Yeah.
Being able to add up a whole list of 2-digit numbers when you can't even write your name is still quite something to see. So by the time he was 10, it's like, ask me anything. And a witness gave him 2 rows of 12 figures to add up. And he did that. And then he had another hour's worth of questions. And at the end of the hour, the person who'd originally seen him in Wellington said, do you remember the first question? And he gave back all of the numbers that he'd added up. So he didn't just remember the answer, he remembered all of the figures from the first question.
So is it mentioned by this time whether he has had any kind of reading, learning by this time?
No, I think he was still unable to read when he was 10.
Okay.
I don't think he'd done any more schooling at that point. But the thing I love about this is that after that hour, he then asked, could he ask a mathematical question of the people that had been questioning him? And the audience said, yeah, that's fine. So he said, okay, a man found 13 cats in his garden. He got out his gun and fired at them and killed 7. How many were left? And the answer was given back as 6. And Bidder said, wrong, none. All the rest ran away.
Smart boy.
So he was a proper 10-year-old. Yeah, he was a kid. He had a sense of fun, and from what I understand, he never lost that sense of fun. So he was quite an imp about it. He wasn't just one of these really precocious, really focused. He enjoyed things. Now, I think he had a little bit of a charmed life, and maybe it was the nature of visiting the fairs, but he got to meet plenty of important people. One of the people he met was John Herschel, son of the astronomer William Herschel, and John Herschel was pretty smart himself. And Herschel was impressed with George.
That's saying something.
So, and with a few of John Herschel's friends, they actually paid for him to go to a grammar school.
Well, that is true.
They thought,
impressed.
yeah, so they thought, this kid is being wasted just doing these sums for fun. So they arranged for him to go to a grammar school at Camberwell, which is now in South London. And whilst he was there, so before he was 12 years old, he actually, one of the exhibitions of his calculating ability was in front of Queen Charlotte, who was the wife of King George III.
Oh, wow.
So he was circulating in the right circles. Now, I don't know about you, but hearing about this calculating boy, I wanted to know, what sort of questions was he being asked?
Well, since there has been kind of like, it's being increasing or getting better and better at doing things, so you would expect that as he gets older, things are going to be like questions are going to be more challenging.
Sure. So before he was 12, Queen Charlotte asked, how many days would a snail be creeping at the rate of 8 feet per day from Land's End in Cornwall to Farrat's Head in Scotland if the total distance covered is 838 miles?
Oh.
Now, as a clue, it did take the snail longer than it took us.
Yeah,
But
I
the
would
answer,
hope so.
yes, we were covering more than 8 feet, 2.5 meters per day. Yes. But the answer was 553,080 days, plus a little bit. Now, as far as I'm aware, that's not a standard snail migration route. So that's the sort of thing he was doing. Now, another question, I'm only going to do a few. I'm not going to give the whole list of all the different questions, but another one was, suppose an acre of ground to contain 256 trees, each tree with 53 limbs, each limb with 196 twigs, each twig with 45 leaves. How many leaves in total? Which, if you could work it out in your head, it would probably take more than the less than a minute that it took George.
No, it would take plenty of twigs, I'm sure.
The answer, just in case anyone's interested, is 119,669,670. 760, sorry.
Ah, right. Okay. Nice correction there.
Now, he was travelling all round the place, and one of the places that his father exhibited him was in Edinburgh.
Okay.
And whilst he was in Edinburgh, he was noticed by quite a prominent lawyer called Henry Jardine. He was a kind of a lawyer and philanthropist. I never knew you could be both.
Yeah, they made them different those days, I suppose.
Yes. Now, again, Jardine was very impressed with him, and he had some quite influential and quite rich friends. And they thought, this young lad's being a little bit wasted. They thought that he needed a proper education.
Yeah.
So he'd spent a couple of years at this grammar school in Camberwell, but Bidder's father was a stonemason. He was thinking, we can earn amounts of money. Yeah, he was earning quite good money, more than a stonemason could, by exhibiting his son. So he'd taken him away from the school, took him up to Edinburgh, and Jardine and his friends basically said to Mr. Bidder Senior, look, here's some money, you go off back to Devon, we're going to see your boy through an education. If he was still not really a reader, then he basically started with a bit of private tutoring. And then when he was 14, he attended Edinburgh University.
Well, that's rather, rapid progression on that side, but
yeah,
thank goodness that they recognized it.
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting. One of the flyers that I saw for him being exhibited, it wasn't just in these fairs and showgrounds that I think probably both of us are imagining. A lot of it was like in the back room of a pub, which is probably not the ideal environment to be bringing up a 10-year-old.
Yeah, still, exactly.
But yeah, so he went from being illiterate at 10 to attending Edinburgh University at 14. And I love the fact that he studied mathematics under William Wallace.
Now,
not that
how many
William
thought
Wallace.
thrusts does it take?
Yes, quite. Yes. How many soldiers do we need on our side to achieve freedom?
Yeah. I presume
Um,
we're not talking about the same guy.
it's a different William Wallace. Yes, because the original William Wallace did know how to divide into four, didn't he?
Yeah, certainly had that down.
Now, he did excel at the university. He was there at the same time as Robert Stevenson, who
Hmm.
was the son of George Stevenson, and George and Robert would basically become absolute keystones, absolute pillars of railway engineering
Okay.
and other engineering as well. But it doesn't seem like they studied together. They weren't taking the same classes and they weren't friends at the university. But
Hmm.
later on in life, they would form a really important, really close bond.
Okay.
So he started the university at 14. He did his first 2 years in a single year.
Hmm.
In the third year, which was basically his second year at the university, he won a mathematics prize. So he was doing
Yeah.
pretty well. He left Edinburgh when he was 18 to basically go and get a job.
Mm.
So his first job was with the Ordnance Survey.
Hmm.
And his initial job was in Cardiff. So he had to get from Edinburgh down to Cardiff at the age of 18. He went by something called the telegraph from Edinburgh to Glasgow, which
Okay.
I'm assuming is some sort of post coach.
Yeah.
So horse and carriage carrying mail. He then took a steamboat from Greenock down to Cardiff. It took 5 days though.
Okay.
So his first job was with the Ordnance Survey, where he was there to learn surveying and drawing plans. He was initially taken on as what we these days call an intern.
Hmm.
So he didn't get a salary, but he did learn how to do it. And this is another one of those areas where it feels like there's kind of invisible hands at work, because the head of the Ordnance Survey, very important chap called Major Colby of the Royal Engineers. The Ordnance Survey was effectively a division of the Royal Engineers at the time.
Oh, yeah.
He visited Cardiff, and I think specifically to see George Parker Bidder.
Ah, okay.
And he wrote to somebody called Major General Sir George Murray about him and said, look, we need him up in London. So he was, as soon as Colby had met him, he said, you need to be not on a salary of 0, you need to be on a salary of 3 shillings a day, which would have been a decent income for an 18-year-old lad.
Oh, yeah.
And he was then told, no choices in this, it's you now work in London. So you've got to make your way from Cardiff to London. But the good news is you're going to be on 5 shillings a day. So 60% pay rise 3 months after he'd arrived in Cardiff. So he was already on the up and up.
Oh, yeah. That's definitely, again, good increase.
So he did some surveying work, and there would have been a lot of physically going to places to work out what was there, where hills were, where towns were, and so on.
I've heard that the ordnance maps can be really, really informative in the sense that things of interest, apart from just the landscape and so forth, but there would be there you have this kind of Roman ruin, or you have this kind of a church or whatever, and those are also pointed out in the map, so you have a lot more information than just the standard what you see today.
Oh, yes, they were wonderful, wonderful maps, and very influential as well. So he did some surveying, and he was actually sent to survey down in Devon around about December of 1824. So he managed to spend his 18th Christmas with his family, which was nice.
That's nice. Yeah.
In 1825, he attended the Institution of Civil Engineers for the first time, and he met somebody at that meeting called a Mr. Palmer. That's all he records it as, is met Mr. Palmer, and Palmer offered him a job. Now, Henry Jardine, the fella that had put him through
Yeah.
Edinburgh University, wrote to the head of the Ordnance Survey asking for his blessing for George to leave the Ordnance Survey. And
Okay.
and George was given that blessing, so he was allowed to leave. So they obviously left on good terms. And so in April 1825, before his 19th birthday, he had then joined Henry Robinson Palmer, who was an engineer that was just starting his own engineering practice, having worked for Thomas Telford for 7 years. And Telford was a really preeminent engineer prior to that. I think Telford built the Menai Bridge,
Okay.
joining Wales to Anglesey. I think that was one of his projects, but he had loads and loads. Yeah, I can't do Telford justice just by mentioning a couple of his projects. He was a really preeminent engineer.
Mhm.
So Henry Robinson Palmer had set up on his own, and he was one of the founders of the Institution of Civil Engineers. But this was, what were we talking now? 1825, and the world's first public steam railway opened in 1825.
Ah, okay. New era.
So this was a good time to be an engineer. This was
Oh,
a
yeah.
good time to be a surveyor. So George's role was to survey proposed railways, but every railway had to be approved. So a parliamentary bill had to be passed to allow any railway to be constructed. And that meant that you would have committees, and those select committees would hear evidence and use that evidence to decide whether they would approve this bill or that bill for building a railway. And in 1826, so in his 20th year, possibly before his 20th birthday, he had to attend a House of Lords committee to give expert evidence. At that age, his opposing counsel, people that would have been much more experienced, much more used to this sort of thing. This was his first time appearing in a parliamentary committee, and there was an objection raised against him because nature had endowed him with particular qualities that did not place his opponents on a fair footing with him. I think part of their objection wasn't even at how good he was at putting his case, it was how good he was at picking holes in their case. He also got involved in surveying work on docks. He worked on the old Shadwell Basin of London dock. And I think it's interesting the way that he was paid, because it seems that he was well remunerated, but it was that he was well remunerated when the money came in, because he was effectively working for this Palmer.
Right.
And Palmer would pay him, like some days he'd get £1 and some days he'd get £15. Basically, he'd be working for next to nothing one day and then a lovely payout the next day, and then not knowing what he was going to get the next day.
Well, in a way, if you're talking about pounds, so the fact that
Yes,
he's getting
yeah.
this kind of money, it's astounding. And at such
Yes,
an early
quite,
age.
yes. But because it was up and down,
Yeah.
he did decide he needed something a little bit stable as well. So as well as doing all of this work and supervising the building of the Shadwell Basin would have been a pretty full-time job, but he also took on a role with the Royal Exchange Assurance Company.
Yeah.
So,
Let me
which paid him an extra
calculate.
£100 a year.
Let me calculate some assurances while I'm having my lunch and then continue with the basin.
I think it would have been one of those things where he was doing a day's work in his lunch hour kind of thing, because of his genius with arithmetic. Nevertheless, that would have had to have made 1827 quite a tiring year, I would have thought. Then he did some work on draining Romney Marsh during 1828. So he's having to do some varied stuff here. There's a very flowery description that the Institution of Civil Engineers give for what the job of the civil engineer is, which is that it is the art of directing the great sources of power in nature for the use and convenience of man. Now, who wouldn't want that as a job description?
Well, Sounds very impressive.
But I think basically the way that I view it is that the architect comes up with something that looks lovely and the engineer makes sure it'll work.
Yeah.
And the surveyor makes sure we've got the stuff to do it with.
Yeah.
So they would be the resources aspect of it. And he was doing surveying and engineering. So how big a bridge does this have to be? We'll make it look like you've done it, but what stone do we need? What girders do we need? What size girders do we need? And then the surveyor is like, how many yards of steel do we need? How many tons of earth, etc., etc., and how many people?
Well, in a way, he was doing both the engineering and the, let's say, commissioning of the actual product.
And if the architect comes along at the end of the project and says, this looks nothing like what I drew, it's like, well, it's there now. What you going to do? You got paid. So it was an absolutely essential role. And when you think something like building a railway, trains today, they aren't very good at going up and down hills, so they need it to be as level, as flat as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are faced with hills and valleys, you've got to build bridges, viaducts, tunnels, all of those. There's a huge amount of work in each element of that. In 1834, so this is when George was 28, Thomas Telford died. And he'd been such a powerful, important engineer that when the Institution of Civil Engineers had been created, Telford was made life president. Okay. So that's all we need. We need one person in charge. That's it. After he went, they decided the post would then be an annual one. And actually, George put his name forward to be the second ever president of the institution. He didn't get the role. It went to somebody that was a little older, a little more experienced. But Bidder's time would come. A bit more established, absolutely. But after losing Telford, he gained somebody called Georgina Harby. And that was a bit more of an immediate impression. Romance flourished and they got married within the year.
Oh, okay.
And when we were discussing our previous character for the previous episode, Minna, we were chuckling about how the person that Jack Mytton met, that was not particularly Jane Austen in terms of the romance involved. It was just meeting somebody on Westminster Bridge and saying, I'll give you 500 quid to come live with me. This, I think, this would have been much more Jane Austen. The romance was carried out mainly by letter.
Oh, how sweet.
When he was putting entries in his diary about liaisons with her, he would talk about going out with the Mrs. Harby, as in it was Georgina and her sister. So he wasn't alone with Georgina.
Oh, no. I mean, if he was carrying out, a proper courtship and etc., there would have been absolutely no unsupervised, time together.
But after a while, he sought permission from her father. He demonstrated his suitability as a husband, and he did it successfully because, as I say, they were married within a year of him actually meeting her. I love the fact that the romance was done largely by letter, but he didn't stop writing letters once he got a ring on her finger. Because all of his work, there would have been an awful lot of work on site. He spent most of the time not being at home. Yeah. And he wrote to her nearly every day for the next 40 years. So one of his early roles was with the Stephensons. So George Stephenson is the name that's associated with Stephenson's rocket, the first train that was used on the Stockton and Darlington Railway. So George Stephenson is seen in many ways as being the father of the railway. And bear in mind that the Stockton to Darlington Railway was the first public railway anywhere in the world. So this really was the birth of railways. His son Robert kind of took it on from George, but they, for probably 20 years, were working as a father and son partnership. But for most of that time, Bidder was the third spoke of that three-spoke wheel.
Okay.
But he tends not to be remembered as well as those two. He was employed full-time for the London and Birmingham Railway, which was one of the Stephenson projects. But it really seems that having a Monday to Friday, or for him it would have been a Monday to Saturday job, didn't really work for him. He liked to be doing as many different projects as possible. And I think part of that would be just perhaps he'd get bored if it was too straightforward to work a day.
Well, in a way, I mean, it sounds like, once he got going, it was like he just wanted to, I mean, these very different roles in different environments, as in, the draining and building the harbours, and then railways, and, all these different things. It was something like that he could just really apply his talents and sink his teeth into it, and etc. And good heavens, I mean, and if he's doing insurances in between somewhere there as well, it's kind of the kind of enterprising mind.
Now, one engineer that I haven't mentioned so far that was very well known in this first half of the 19th century is Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Now, Brunel was a member of the Institution of Civil Engineers as well, and he is somebody that there is massive respect for, and quite rightly so. He was involved in some incredible projects, but Bidder got to know Brunel partly through them both being members of the Civil Engineers Institution, and I've got a note that it's not clear how well they got on. Because I think there's a little bit of conflicting stuff. Bidder's diary, for example, one day says, attended at the Engineers Institution and argued with Brunel and Vignol. Vignol was another prominent rail engineer. So it's like, oh, yeah, went along to the Engineers Institution and had an argument with the country's leading engineer. But he also described Brunel a little bit later on as, it has frequently been my lot to be placed in professional conflict with that gentleman, and I need hardly say that I found him a very dangerous and most able adversary. But for the next 17 years, Bidder was a very busy engineer, and I've called him engineer with a capital E. It was that position of real respect. He was a full partner of Robert Stephenson. He wasn't just an employee. The only slight issue we've got with those years is that these diaries that he kept so carefully, we don't have for that 17-year period. And that's a shame, because his diaries are wonderful. He'll write down what he did in a particular day, but every single diary entry starts with a weather report.
Well, engineers.
Yes, but it was dull and cold, rose at 6:30.
Yep.
Built a dock.
Yeah. Essential.
Had sausages for dinner. But between 1835 and 45, we went through a period where everyone wanted to build a railway. There were some crazy times. It's quite a niche area, talking about the history of railway building in the early part of the 19th century, and one that I'm not going to go a great deal into here. But basically, everyone wanted to build a railway. Now, when all of these railways were being proposed, surveyed, designed, and so on, you'd have thought Bidder would have been busier than anybody else in the country surveying and designing railways. And the notes that I've got is that basically he spent hardly any time doing that, which might sound a bit contradictory, but that's because every one of these had to go through the parliamentary process.
Yeah.
He was the country's leading expert witness to be called. He was spending his whole time in Westminster.
Yeah.
Being the expert witness. So I have got a note that basically he did hardly any surveying work, but I think that's George Parker Bidder hardly any, which probably means as much as anybody else in the country was capable of doing, just that he was knocking it out on a Monday morning rather than spending the whole week doing it. But yes, so it was, again, in this time, everybody was complaining if they were against George Parker Bidder. So we've got no chance then, have we?
Well, once you start doing it well and successfully and etc., I mean, it's very difficult to go against competitor.
I'd like to think that he's got a very appropriate name for that, because in terms of his appearances to be an expert witness in these bills, he very often wouldn't have a vested interest. So he would be working, I guess, for the highest bidder.
Nomen est omen again.
He couldn't possibly be involved in every single project. So he would have just been the independent expert, if you like, independent. One side would have been paying him, the other wouldn't. But that would have been a very busy time for him. But one of the areas where he did do some work was something called the Yarmouth and Norwich Railway. He convinced the directors of that company that they could operate a single track rather than a double track, so half the money, if it was controlled by electric telegraph.
Okay.
Which had only just been invented. So he was a real innovator in the idea of using the electric telegraph. It was really, really brand new. The ink was still wet on the patents. So in the UK, the first telegraphs were used to control railways, and the first railways to use telegraphs were using them under Bidder's kind of direction.
Again, I think that he's because he was so kind of like, multi-interested and doing things on so many levels, so I can imagine that he would be very interested in what would be the latest innovations in that can be applied and etc. So it doesn't surprise me in the least.
So we're in the middle 1830s here, and in 1836 he had his first son. So what did George Parker Bidder call his first son? With sparkling originality, he called him George Parker Bidder.
I give up. I have been lauding his ingenuity and, out of the box thinking, and there it goes. He should have called him Isambard.
Absolutely, he should have. But George Parker Jr., didn't he write the theme from Ghostbusters? No, that was Ray Parker Jr. But George Parker Jr., he thought, what a great idea. So he called his son, eventually, he called him George Parker Bidder.
Now it's just getting very American,
Yes, indeed. And then late on the following year, he would have a daughter as well. He would end up having quite a few children, but I'll get onto that shortly. But when we get on to 1845, there was the founding of the Electric Telegraph Company. And that was set up initially as a telegraph for use on railways, and principally railways that Bidder was involved in. So he was quite a significant shareholder in that company. It then went through various different entities, and it's kind of still with us today as BT.
Okay.
With all of that, he was still clearly then quite busy. He was personally invested in the telegraph company. He was working with the various different committees to give the expert information there. But also in the 1840s, we had something called the Great Gauge Contest. The Great Gauge Contest was the battle between Brunel and everyone else, or principally Stephenson, between how far apart the rails should be on a railway. Because Brunel was convinced it should be 7 feet and 1/4 of an inch, and Stephenson was convinced it should be 4 feet 8.5 inches.
Okay.
And that standard was adopted in 1846. It's one of the few things where Brunel lost.
So he was advocating for the wider set.
Yes, he was.
Why? And
Yes.
and why did Parker win?
I think it says an awful lot about both of them as engineers. Brunel was a money no object. The best engineering solution will in the long run be the right way to go, whereas Stevenson and by definition Bidder were, you've got to take account of the commercial considerations. So it was, I think, purely commercial on their side, and where Brunel was right was that it would be much more comfortable.
Yeah,
It would be much more luxurious.
Yeah.
If you're wider, then the coaches on the trains can be wider. So you can have more room to move about. Isn't that a better way to get from Paddington down to Penzance? And yeah, it would have been nice. It would have been more comfortable, but it would have been hugely expensive. So it's about the only battle that Brunel ever lost.
Yeah.
But we're still using that same gauge today in the UK. But Bidder wrote to his wife on the 1st of July 1845, "I am retained in the great gauge contest, so that my parliamentary career will now last throughout the session, and I shall have played a part in all the great contests." But he was making good money, so he managed to buy a place called Mitcham Hall, which Mitcham is kind of towards the southwest of London. It's within the borough of Merton, so it's within Greater London. But in the 1830s, 1840s, it would have been Mitcham, Surrey. It would have been kind of a little bit outside of London. And he bought a lovely place called Mitcham Hall. It has now been demolished, so I can't show what Mitcham Hall now looks like. But he moved there for health. And just to give an indication as to how busy a B. George was, we know how much work he's been doing. When he was at home, he was quite busy there as well, because he actually fathered 13 children.
Okay, right. Industrious fella.
So he made the most of his weekends, let's put it that way. So he's now, what are we? I said we're mid-1840s.
Yeah.
So he would be about 40 years old. He's had quite a career. Yeah, he's been pretty busy. He's respected in Parliament, and the work that he's doing, things like the building of docks. The UK was kind of leading the world in the development of railways, the dock work, the harbours, the telegraph. And I think the UK had a lot of respect in that sense, because in the second half of the 1840s, the King of Norway basically said, "George, would you mind popping over and sorting out our own railways?" I don't think it went quite like that, but Bidder basically ended up travelling to Norway to oversee the construction of the Norwegian railways. And in 1850, he went to Switzerland to look at some of the burgeoning, developing railways in Switzerland. But he's had quite a career so far. So why is it that chapter 9 of his book is titled 1851 to 59, The Years of Achievement?
Okay.
Well, we haven't even got to his years of achievement. Now, I am going to be skirting over them a bit quicker than we've covered everything so far, because he would have been working harder than ever. He'd have been doing more and more impressive things. But without wishing to denigrate any single project that he was involved in, it's more railways work. It's more docks work. So he was actually the UK signatory to the Norwegian Trunk Railway. So he was right in the middle of designing and implementing the Norwegian Railway. He also worked very closely with the Danish Railway. He worked with the Danish Gas Company. He worked with the Netherlands Land Enclosure Company, which was a joint venture between the UK and the Netherlands. And that's basically land reclamation.
So he basically was like, Romney Marsh is done. Let me speak to the Dutch. Let me get my teeth into something real good.
That's it. I've made England a tiny bit bigger. Now let's make the Netherlands a bit bigger as well by draining off some seawater and reclaiming some polders. So all of these things, yeah, these are massive projects, and he'd have been diving into all of these. Bear in mind, we don't have telephones yet. We don't have motor cars. But he was working in Norway, England, Denmark. He was still working with the telegraph company. Obviously, he was doing work in the Netherlands. So he was running around all over the place.
Yeah. And you didn't have as much railway coverage in these other countries. So it would be back into either steamboats or then land travel, which would be, again, back to horses.
I was kind of skirting over the railway bit. But of course, if you're building a railway, it's because there isn't a railway there.
Yeah.
So you're not going to be able to get the train to work if your work is building a railway. Now, he was doing quite nicely, and I think he liked Norway. He liked it so much that he bought a big chunk of land with a property in Norway. Now, he never looked to move permanently to Norway, but there was a place called, I'm going to call it Stensby.
Yeah.
That is, I think it's now been completely absorbed into Bergen. So I'm hoping there's no such place as Stensby anymore, so that if I am mispronouncing it, no one will know. But he bought this lovely large bit of land. He also bought a yacht called the Mayfly, which he sailed from England up to Norway so that he could show his wife and kids this Stensby that he'd bought. So he was doing okay, and he was investing around the place. But he was a long way from Moretonhampstead, but he'd never forgotten about it. He was still a Devon boy at heart. And in the 1850s, he bought a house in Dartmouth, but it was a fixer-upper, and he didn't do it himself. So by 1860, it was kind of ready to move into. And that was a house that he called Ravensbury. As he got older, he would spend more and more time down at the house in Dartmouth. But one other significant project that he was involved in was the generation of Victoria Dock. Now, the work there was completed in 1855, so that would have been when Bidder was 49. And I've got a slight sort of affinity to Victoria Dock because in my day job, I've got lots of different places that I work, but one of the places that I work every fortnight, I do 1 day per fortnight delivering training basically just across the road from Victoria Dock. So I see Victoria Dock every couple of weeks. Now, unfortunately, if George were to come back, he would not recognise Victoria Dock. The layout would be similar, although he'd probably be quite disappointed that it's not a working dock anymore. It's still there very much. And the initial idea for the dock does seem to have been somebody else. There was somebody called Mr. Blythe who gave the idea to Bidder, but he said, that's a great idea. I'm going to make this happen. So he can't claim the initial inspiration, but he took the idea forward. He made it work. The land could be acquired cheaply. The dock could be developed cheaply compared to other places. And it just so happened to be nice and close to a railway line that he built.
Again, makes perfect sense. Exactly.
I think it's a very interesting situation that he's costed the project down to the penny, to the extent that his budget was costed down as £938,164, 11 shillings and 4 pence, which you'd think is a little more detailed than you might need.
No, that's engineering mind again.
Yes, indeed. But that 938k in the 1850s is about 164 million pounds in today's money. That was a serious project.
Oh, yeah. definitely.
But one thing that did make me smile is that part of the cost was for extra land. It seems like some of that extra land was owned by a company, and the largest shareholder in that company was George Parker Bidder.
Why not?
Absolutely, why wouldn't you? Yes, indeed. Something else that came along, and I had no idea Bidder had anything to do with this, he's obscure and shouldn't be, was in 1857, there was a decision made about the drainage, the issue of the sewers in London. The Metropolitan Board of Works decided that London's drainage issues needed to be sorted out, and they appointed somebody called Joseph Bazalgette. Everyone in London knows that the sewers under their feet were created by Bazalgette. One of the people that was appointed as a coadjutor for Bazalgette was George Parker Bidder.
That's very typical, yeah.
Even now, I think there is a lot of work still going on what we call the super sewer, but the system that Bazalgette built in the 1850s is still in use today.
Yeah, get it working.
The
and
2020s.
And when things were done properly, as they say.
So I've said that he was rivals with Isambard Brunel, and professionally they were, but it does seem that there was a friendship developed out of that professional respect, because one of the things that Bidder was involved in was actually Brunel's funeral arrangements.
Okay.
Brunel died in 1859, and George was one of the people that made the arrangements for Brunel's funeral. The end of 1859 for engineering was a sad time, because within a few weeks of Brunel going, Robert Stevenson also passed away.
Oh dear.
And that would have been a tricky time for George, because he was also one of Robert Stevenson's executors. He referred to Robert Stevenson as being like an older brother to him. So they were business partners, but he saw him as so much more than that. So that would have been quite a difficult time for him. He basically, within less than a month, he'd been involved in burying two of Britain's great engineers. And one of them he called a friend, and the other he called like an older brother.
Yeah.
At the end of 1859, he finally became president of ICE when he was 53. So this is where we finally get him heading up the Institution of Civil Engineers. He was in post for 2 years, but he was quite unusual in that he was one of the first presidents of the institution to be an active ex-president. And what I mean by that is, unfortunately, all of the previous ones had left post because they passed away.
Yeah, feet first.
Yes, quite. Yeah, so he survived for quite a few more years and was still very active as an ex-president. And I think it almost became quite a thing for the institution themselves, is what do we even do with an ex-president? Yeah, we normally bury them, but he's far too alive to be doing that too.
As too good an engineer, he would figure out a way to climb out anyway.
Yes, indeed. Now, I don't know if you remember, you and I have actually cycled over the Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol.
Was that the one? It was over quite impressive, almost gorge-like.
You've got it,
sort
yes.
Of river, etc. It looked very, as in, well, beautiful bridge and everything else, but it looked quite daunting.
So that bridge is seen as Brunel's Clifton Suspension Bridge. It was Brunel who designed it. It was Brunel's brainchild, but he never saw it completed because they ran out of money.
Oh, okay.
And there was a hiatus of, I forget how many years, but let's say 20 years. There was a significant hiatus where the bridge had been started but not finished due to lack of funds. One of the people that invested in completing the bridge was our friend George.
Ah, okay.
He also acted as a consulting engineer to something called the Cinder Railway, which ran from Karachi to Kotri in what is now Pakistan, although we don't think he actually went out there for that. I think that was a desk job.
One would hope. I mean, the man was all over the place anyway.
Yes. But as he got older, he did start to slow down a bit on the actual project work because he had these investments in these different companies, the telegraph company, the various different things that he had fingers in pies in anyway. There were no really big new projects. He was still attending the Civil Engineers Institution on a regular basis. So he was still very much involved in that. But he was starting to get infirm and would spend more and more time at his house in Dartmouth, down in Devon. He gave his last address to the Institution of Civil Engineers in 1873, when he would have been 67, talking about the Indian railways. He did make a trip out to the Netherlands to see the polders that he'd been instrumental in developing in 1874. He was invited to the 50th anniversary of the Stockton and Darlington Railway in 1875. Although he had no direct involvement in that, he was such an eminent engineer that it's, look, we're having a big party, please come. But he didn't attend that. He wrote to his son, George Parker Jr., in 1877 now that he was quite unable to undertake the slightest exertion physically, and indeed even much mental exertion exhausts my strength. And I found that quite sad.
Well,
This is the boy that could work out how long it would take a snail to crawl the length of Britain in a minute is now finding it exhausting to do any sort of mental exertion at all.
but well, he's pushing 70 and he's led a very industrious life.
Well, when you think Brunel basically worked himself to death at an age much younger than Bidder is now.
Yeah.
Stevenson the same, actually George and Robert Stevenson the same, Thomas Telford the same. This was a role that really took it out of you.
Well,
You know,
yes.
being an engineer in the first half of the 19th century, it was hard work. He was regularly working 16, 18-hour days at his busiest. And the graveyard that he's in is a place called Stoke Fleming, which is just down the road from where he was living in Dartmouth, and that's only a few miles away from where he was born in Moretonhampstead. So he started life and finished life very much as a Devon boy. Now, when we were in Moretonhampstead in 2017, we went very close to Lime Street, the street where he was born, but we wouldn't have seen anything remarkable. In 2020, there was a lovely statue erected to George, and there's a really nice information panel next to it. And there was a local person in Moretonhampstead who did an awful lot of work to get the permission and then raise the funds to commission and install this statue. So there is now a permanent monument to George in the centre of Moretonhampstead. In terms of the family, George Parker Jr. was quite successful in his own right, and he seems to have inherited some of his father's mathematical ability. George Parker III, he was also very successful in a different field altogether. But funny enough, even E.F. Clarke, who is a great-great-grandson, he is an engineer, and he's worked on railways as well. So he is a railway engineer himself. So it's clear that apples don't fall far from the tree.
Yeah, definitely. Family genes.
Yes, indeed. So I consider that George Parker Bidder is far too obscure. He absolutely deserves to be taken out of the obscure.